Hello, in this part of the presentation, we are going to discuss the cladograms and the phylogenetic trees. Maybe you are familiar with their designs because you have seen some of them on your worksheets. But before starting this, I just want to say that in the previous part, I'm not sure what I exactly said, but I just want to emphasize that if we have two radioactive isotopes, like for example, carbon 12 and carbon 14, then they have the same number of protons, but the carbon 14 has two more neutrons. So they should have the same number of protons because the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. So the difference essentially is in the number of neutrons. But after and this is important to know, after decay of the radioactive material and the emission of some alpha particles or some beta particles, of course, the number of protons might be changed, and that's why we might get a different element. So this was important to highlight or emphasize at the beginning because I might have confused you by saying something different, but essentially when we have two radioactive isotopes, as we said at the beginning in biochemistry, we have the same number of protons, which is equal to the same number of the same number of electrons, which is equal to the same number of protons, but the difference is in the number of neutrons. So, but after decay and the emission of alpha particles and beta particles, the number of protons might differ and we might obtain a different element. And now let's move on to the cladograms. The cladograms are a way of representing the evolutionary relationships between different groups of organisms. And they are called cladograms because they arrange the living organisms in the form of clades. So the clades will share common characteristics that are not shared by other clades in the cladogram. Sometimes we also have what we call the phylogenetic tree, and it looks much like the cladogram. The phylogenetic tree looks much like the cladogram, but the way the phylogenetic tree is being designed, the basis on which the phylogenetic tree is designed is what makes the difference. So the phylogenetic tree is a branching tree diagram, and the cladogram is also a branching tree diagram. But the cladogram will arrange the organisms time-wise, but the phylogenetic tree will arrange the organisms according to the emergence of new genes. So it is mainly dependent on the genotype of the individuals. What three things does a cladogram show? The three key aspects of the cladogram, as you see here, is the root of the cladogram, and the root of the cladogram represents the ancestor from which all the other organisms branch off. And then we have the clades, and we're going to see what a clade is. In this phylogenetic tree, it's not easy to highlight a clade because here, for example, the tortoise will be one clade, the horse will be one clade, but there are other cladograms where the clade contains several related species. So we'll be seeing this later on. So we have the root, and then we have the nodes. These are considered the nodes where there is development of a new species. So here we have the ancestor, and usually we don't put the dot here because we leave it open. So the ancestor might be present millions of years ago. The line might extend millions of years ago, but every time we have a new species that branches off or that appears or that emerges, we have a node. So the root, the definition of the root is the initial ancestor that is common to all the living organisms that come afterward, and the clades are the branches. Here, of course, the branch contains only one species. Every branch contains only one species and will be considered a clade. So a clade is what you can like detach, just like the branch of a tree, for example, and it indicates the related groups and their common ancestors. Sometimes you will see a better representation of the clade. For example, you have the line like this, and then you have, so this is the old ancestor in the past, and then this is a more recent ancestor. We can say that this is a more recent ancestor, and the more recent ancestor will be like giving off two more species, for example, A and B. In such a case, we consider that A and B are a clade. So the clade is a branch that indicates the related groups and their common ancestor. And the node is the point that indicates the hypothetical ancestor or the development of a new species. This is the hypothetical ancestor. Why do we say hypothetical? Because all the cladograms and the phylogenetic trees are hypothetical, meaning that they are like hypotheses the scientists do, and they might be true or false, and it is for the scientists to work hard to prove that this representation they gave about the cladogram or the phylogenetic tree is correct. So the cladogram will use lines, as we saw in the previous diagram, that branch off in different directions to end up by having a clade. And the clade, as we said, is a group of, I would rather add, related organisms with a last common ancestor, And the cladogram, this is very important to know, follows the rule of parsimony. What is the rule of parsimony? It is that the rule of parsimony states that, or is any hypothesis that requires fewer assumptions and therefore is more defensible, meaning that when you draw the cladogram, you hypothesize, for example, a certain species that emerged here, or a certain change that emerged here, and then after a while there is another change, and so on. So every time you have one change and you have to prove one change or disprove one change. So one change at a time is more defensible and easier to defend and easier to support than multiple changes that occur at a time. That's why they have the rule of parsimony tells you that it is better to split your hypothesis into minor single changes so that your hypothesis is easier to defend later on. Here, for example, we have three different species of birds, and there are three hypotheses. Of course, you can put the hypothesis you want, but at the end of the day, you have to prove this hypothesis. You have to be able to prove that hypothesis. For example, in that cladogram, if you look at that cladogram, then this is the old ancestor, and this is a more recent, so here actually, sorry, I'll erase this. Okay. So here in that cladogram, we can see that we have a recent ancestor, okay, and that recent ancestor has given three species, species 1, species 2, and species 3, and species 1 and 2 are more closely related because they still have a more recent ancestor, okay? So 1 and 2 together form a clade. So this is a clade. In the other representation that might have been presented by another scientist, for example, it's the same design. We have the same branches, the same nodes, and the same divergence, but here we have put 1 and 3 together. If you put 1 and 3 together in the same clade, then This simply means that 1 and 3 are more related than 2. And the third possibility is that you put 2 and 3 in the same clade, and in such a case, they would be more related to each other than number 1. In the cladogram, we also have other definitions. For example, we have the in-group. Say, for example, we have an old ancestor, and then at node A, we had an outgroup. At node B, we have group 1 or taxon 1. At point C, we had taxon 2. And then what remains is taxon 3. Okay? So what is the in-group? The in-group is the group in question, the group of taxons we are studying, the group of taxons where we want to prove that or disprove that there is an ancestral relationship and an evolutionary relationship between the taxons. The outgroup is the odd out group, meaning that it is not related to the other three, and it is not the group we are studying, but we can use it for comparison. Okay. Now we're going to see some definitions. For example, we have monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic clades. What's the difference between the two? The monophyletic means that we have one clade. The paraphyletic means around one clade. And the polyphyletic means many clades together. And we are going to see this on the diagram. For example, if you look here at the bottom, you have taxon H, taxon I, and taxon J. They represent a monophyletic group. How can we define a monophyletic group? A monophyletic group is a group that can be removed from the tree with a single cut. For example, here, if you cut here, then you will remove the clade. I'm sorry, I put the cut here. Okay. So again, a monophyletic group is a group that can be removed from the tree by a single cut. So if you cut here or you cut there, you will remove that group, and they have a common ancestor. This is the common ancestor of this monophyletic group. But a polyphyletic group, that one, which is the polyphyletic group, the common ancestor here, if G was not present, if G were not present, then the common ancestor of those two would be here, of E and F would be here. Because G was included, then this cannot be the common ancestor of E, F, and G. But the common ancestor of E, F, and G is present here. So this polyphyletic group does not only include E and F that belong to one common ancestor, but it also takes with it G that belongs to another more recent ancestor, and therefore it takes from many groups, and it is a polyphyletic group. The paraphyletic group, it includes the common ancestor, B, C, and D that are derived from the common ancestor, but it skips A, so it does not include all of the descendants. So the monophyletic group again includes the organisms that belong to one common ancestor. The polyphyletic group includes the organisms that belong to a common ancestor and a few more. So in poly means many, we will include more than the ones that belong to this ancestor. In the paraphyletic group, we will include less. You can see, of course, that A has been skipped. So we included less. Okay. Now, in the grouping, the most recent common ancestor is the one that is included. I think this slide needs re-editing because it's not well organized. Anyway, the diagram is more clarifies more the concept of paraphyletic, polyphyletic, and monophyletic groups. And here we would have some definitions. It is very important to study this slide that contains those definitions. So we have the root, that is the starting point of the diagram, and it includes the common initial ancestor. And by common, we mean that it is an ancestor to all the organisms that are coming later on. The node will correspond to the common ancestor for some species, not all the descendants. And then we have the terminal node, which is, of course, the last common ancestor. For example, here, this can be, no, actually, no. For example, this is here, this is the, sorry. This is, for example, a terminal node. It is the last and most recent common ancestor. Here also, we have a terminal node. And then we have an in group, as I told you before. It is the group of organisms in question that we are considering, and it comprises, of course, most of the branches of the cladogram, but the outgroup is just there for comparison. It does not belong to the in group. Now, what are the flaws of a cladogram? First of all, the cladograms have limited significance because they do not show how the ancestors are related to their descendants. The cladograms do not show us the way they evolved. They do not classify the living organisms, for example, according to mutations and the emergence of new genes like the phylogenetic tree. Furthermore, although the cladograms classify the organisms according to time-wise, meaning that we talk about an older ancestor, a more recent ancestor, yet the cladograms will indicate you the most important benefit of the cladogram is that they indicate you the common ancestor. So, for example, you can say that this one is the initial common ancestor. That one is a common ancestor for A, B, C, and D. That one is a common ancestor for E and F. That one is a common ancestor for G, H, I, and J. But that one is a common ancestor for I and J only. So it is important to know the ancestry, the common ancestry for a particular group of organisms. But it does not tell you how much time exactly elapses between the old ancestor and the emergence of the new ancestor. So the two flaws of the cladogram is that the first one is that it does not show the relationship, especially the genetic relationship. And number two, it does not show exactly, or cladograms in general do not show the precise time or the precise time difference actually, okay? Now, this is a cladogram, as you can see. Here we can see a node. This is the root because this is the origin. But here, for example, we can see an internal node. Here we can see an internal node. And the internode is the distance between the two nodes. And now we're going to explain this cladogram. For example, if we have a common ancestor, okay, and that all of a sudden there was like emergence of organisms that had this allele that is responsible for hair formation. Of course, you can see that this emergence of the species that this is emergence of the horse species, emergence of the wolf species, emergence of the leopard species, and so on. You can see that the tortoise was earlier, was older in age in the history of Earth, and therefore, since the tortoise came before the development of hair, then it will be the outgroup. So the tortoise here will be the out group. The horse, the wolf, the leopard, the house cat will be the in group. Why did we classify them like this? And what's the interpretation of that cladogram? All the organisms or all the species which will develop after the development of hair will have hair. So the horse, the wolf, the leopard, and the house cat will all have hair. And then there was the emergence of a new shared characteristic, which is being carnivore. The horse is not, because the horse was present before this. So wolf, leopard, and house cat are all carnivores. And then retractable claws, leopard and house cat only. So if you are asked how many organisms have retractable claws, the leopard and the house cat. But how many organisms have purring? It is only the house cat. How many organisms here are carnivores? Then it is the wolf, the leopard, and the house cat. But the horse and the tortoise are not carnivores. How many organisms have hair? Then you would say the horse, the wolf, the leopard, and the house cat. These are called shared characteristics. So having hair is shared by the horse, wolf, leopard, and house cat. Being a carnivore is shared by wolf, leopard, and house cat. Retractable claws are shared by leopard and house cat, and purring is only a property of the cat. Every new characteristic that develops is called a derived trait, Here again, we have another cladogram. You can see the root of the cladogram. You can see a node. You can see a clade. So A and B form a clade, and C is an outgroup. So green represents the unique history of A. B represents the unique characteristics or history of B. And here you have shared characteristics between A and B, and C, of course, is the out group. Does C have common characteristics with A and B? Yes, of course, because they all show an old common ancestor here. So they have properties in common, A, B, and C, but of course, A and B would be closer to each other than C. Here again, we can have a table to represent the cladograms. And here, the common ancestor had vertebrae, and therefore all the descendants, the shark, the bullfrog, the kangaroo, and the human beings had vertebrae. Now, 2 pairs of limbs only. The shark, of course, does not have 2 pairs of limbs. The shark has 1 pair of limbs, so it doesn't have 2 pairs of limbs. It's present only in the bullfrog, so this property is shared only by these organisms. And then the mammary glands are shared only by the kangaroo and human being. And then the placenta is present only in human beings. Of course, this organism that does not have all the other characteristics will be the species that is formed first, according to what scientists think, and the human being will be the most recent because it shares all the characteristics. This is similar to that cladogram where the tortoise is supposed to be the one that appeared first, and the house cat the one that appeared the latest. But of course, as I told you before, as a believer, I think, and all believers think, that all these organisms have been created at the same time. And therefore, there is no species that developed earlier, no species that developed later. They were all created at the beginning of life on Earth. Sorry. But this doesn't mean that each species is not exposed to evolutionary changes. Of course, we do believe in natural selection. We do believe in environmental and selective pressures. Here again, we have, it might be considered a cladogram. It might be considered a phylogenetic tree according to how they classified these organisms. For example, they all belong to eukaryotes. Here you have a node, okay? And here we start having a derived characteristic. So here, for example, the derived characteristic is the appearance of, here, the vertebrae. The derived characteristic is written next to the node. So eukaryotes, those that have true cells, might be vertebrates or might be invertebrates. Okay, but at that node, there was a new, at that node, okay, we start the vertebrates. So here we have the fish. Of course, I don't know what they were thinking of when they drew that phylogenetic tree. Did they think that the original, for example, ancestor was most probably, yes, we know now that eukaryotes are vertebrates and invertebrates, but according to that phylogenetic tree, then most probably the scientists who designed this tree are supposing that eukaryotes were all invertebrates, and then all of a sudden there was a derived trait that appeared, and that derived trait is the appearance of vertebrae, and then another derived trait, which is the appearance of forelimbs. So the fish do not have forelimbs. And then another trait at this node, a new species appeared, or a new ancestor that had an amniotic egg, and then eggshells. So we have reptiles and birds, and then the appearance of a new derived trait, which is hair and fur, that made the rodents and primates appear. Of course, again, we do not believe in that. We believe in the creation of all organisms at the same time. But let's make use of that phylogenetic tree or cladogram. So if I ever ask you which organisms have vertebrate, then all these organisms would have vertebrates. Vertebrates is a shared characteristics in all of them. And then what is the shared character? The next shared characteristic, forelimbs. But forelimbs is shared only by the amphibians, reptiles, birds, rodents, and primates, but not by the fish. The amniotic egg is shared by reptiles, birds, rodents, and primates. So every time you have a new characteristic, a new derived traits, then all the organisms that come afterward will have that trait. Here I'm just reminding you of the original taxonomy, of the original classification of living organisms. We used to classify organisms into kingdoms, like kingdom Planta and kingdom Animalia, and then we classify every kingdom into phyla, and then every phylum into class, and so on. In evolution, we usually talk about species, and we sometimes call about genuses. But in order for you to memorize this, you can say, kids play chess on 50 giant squares. So in order to remember this, you can say, kids play chess on 50 giant squares. So K stands for kingdom, P stands for phylum, C stands for chess, C stands for class, O stands for order, F stands for family, G stands for genus, and S stands for species. So here, this picture shows you the difference between a cladogram and a phylogenetic tree. In the cladogram, the relationships are hypothetical because they're not based on any evidence, any molecular or genetic evidence. So you can easily make a cladogram, but you cannot easily make a phylogenetic tree. So on the test, we would rather be asking you to draw cladograms than phylogenetic trees, because in phylogenetic trees, it is based on analysis of DNA and molecular evidence. Okay. Here, this is exactly what we said before. A cladogram shows the passage of time, whereas a phylogenetic tree shows the genetic differences. But the main line on the cladogram is not drawn to a specific scale, but the nodes, when you see nodes, they occur at the start of the branch, And you can see that the nodes that are seen here, for example, if this is the ancestor, are earlier in age than those ones, and those ones are the most recent or the earliest. Okay. Number 3, in a phylogenetic tree, the main line shows the degree to which the organisms change genetically. While this might be over time, the time itself is less important than the amount of genetic difference. So in a phylogenetic tree, when you have a main line or a branch, actually it is a branch, it shows the degree to which the organisms change genetically. So we are talking about a genetic change, but time is less important than in the cladograms. Number 4, what is a derived characteristic? A derived characteristic is a characteristic that evolved and that leads up to a new clade and makes the individuals of that clade form a separate group. This is a derived characteristic, whereas the shared characteristic is the characteristic that they have in common. Here we can see that this is the starting point of the cladogram. This is the earliest and this is the most recent. So we go this direction, and this is the most recent evolutionary development, whereas this is the characteristic that arose first. Okay. Now, if we look here, then the outgroup is the one that is most distantly related. So here we can see that the A species is, because here there was a divergence like this. A went on one side and the 3 other species went on another side. So A will be considered the outgroup. The derived traits that arise suddenly and that result in the formation of a new clade are, this is important, it wasn't written on the previous slide. It is present in the organism but not present in the ancestor. So the derived trait that arises will result in the formation of a new species, in the formation of a new clade, and this derived trait that arises will not be present in the common ancestor, but it might be present in species A, B, and C, for example. And between B, C, and D, we definitely have, because here they have a common ancestor, they will have shared derived characteristics. C and D will have more shared derived characteristics than B and C or than B and D. So we talked here about derived characteristics and shared derived characteristics and the outgroup. And we can deduce this from the table for that phylogenetic tree. For example, if we consider the backbone, the tail, the jawbone, although A has a common ancestor with B, C, and D, yet concerning the backbone, concerning the tail, concerning the jawbone, it doesn't have them, and therefore they are not shared with B, C, and D, and that's why they are closer to each other than they are to A. And if we compare B, C, and D, we find that B has only a backbone, C has a backbone and a tail, D has a backbone, a tail, and a jawbone. Therefore, C and D are closer to each other than B. Thank you, guys. I hope this was understandable and okay. And by having finished this, we would have finished evolution. And what remains is just to be trained on the different types of questions that you can encounter. I just want to say that evolution is important. Its weight on the test is important, and that the phylogenetic trees in particular are important. I just forgot to write something like a recapitulation. So before ending the session, I'll open a new screen and write those 2 important questions. So we will open a new screen, I'm sorry, and we're going to write this question. Number one, how fossil record is at odds with gradualism. The fossil record is what made scientists not accept or reject the theory of gradualism. So how would we answer that question? We would say that gradualism postulates that evolutionary changes, gradualism postulates that evolutionary changes occur in small, slow, gradual steps. So gradualism should present in, or this should be reflected on the fossil record in the form of the absence of any sudden transition. So if this were true, and it is not, if this were true, okay, then there shouldn't be number one, there shouldn't be any missing links, any missing stages, or any missing links between two organisms, and B, there shouldn't be sudden transitions in the fossil, which indicate the sudden appearance of a species. And the second question is about the characteristics of punctuated equilibrium, and this would be our last question and the last item we would be discussing today. So we would first erase and then write the question, which is the characteristics of, so here, number 2, characteristics of punctuated equilibrium. Characteristics of the theory of punctuated equilibrium, or the postulates of the theory of punctuated equilibrium. So we are going to write 3 characteristics of punctuated equilibrium, but it is worth mentioning that punctuated equilibrium is based mainly on the theory of allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation. Why? Because the emergent species will succeed in reproduction and passing on genes to offspring only if they are located in their favorable or comfortable niches where they will be selected for. So the punctuated equilibrium, of course, the characteristics of punctuated equilibrium as postulated by the punctuated equilibrium theory will be the following. Number 1, letter A, new species evolve suddenly after long periods of stasis. They evolve suddenly after long periods of stasis. After long periods of stasis, this is the first characteristic. The second characteristic, that the new species, as we said before several times, the new species arises in a place. That's why we're talking about allopatric speciation. It arises in a geographical area, expands and outcompetes, first expands and then outcompetes, and then replaces the old ancestor, and then And then we have the new species changes the most as it buds or arises from the original population. So the new species changes the most as it buds from the original population. And that's it. Thank you so much, and inshallah the next video will be on ecology. Bye.